Thank you all for joining me today. My name is Sean Ulmer. I'm Executive Director here at the Cedar Rapids Museum of Art. I am thrilled to take a very focused look at one aspect of Grant Wood's life and career, and that's his portraiture. Now, I know many people, when they think of Grant Wood, they think of these wonderful images of the rolling hills of eastern Iowa. Eastern Iowa was his home throughout his entire life, and it's not surprising that these images that he knew so very well, images of the landscape that he knew so very well, would become associated with him. But for many others, it is this one particular work that people think of when they think of Grant Wood. This image, not of the Iowa landscape really, but of Iowans themselves. And while this is not, strictly speaking, a portrait, it is a work of art that is based on actual people, where he used actual models, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. But it got me thinking about this side of his work, if you will. And going through our current large exhibition, Grant Wood Revealed, there are a number of portraits or figurative work in that exhibition, which made me think that it might be worth taking a little bit of a deeper dive into this particular type of subject matter that Grant Wood investigated really throughout his career. And although he may be known for certain individual pieces or a certain type of work, dealing with figuration was something that actually was pervasive throughout his entire career. And we can trace that throughout his career, and it gives us insight into this aspect of what he was doing. And so I want to go through things chronologically. Here we go. And start with a very early work. This may not really truly be a portrait. It's called Boy in a Raincoat. It dates from 1904. Grant Wood was 13 years old when he created this work, so it is a very youthful work. It's a small piece on a non-precious paper, for sure. But he's looking at figuration. He's looking at the figure, sorting it out, trying to get the proportions right. You can see even as a young, very young artist, he has figured out a lot when it comes to figuring out the proportions of the human form. This may have been an individual that he knew, that he decided to sketch down really quickly, or it may have been something that he completely made up out of his own imagination. But there's a certain level of uniqueness and specificity in the facial features, which made me think that it could very well be a portrait of an individual, someone that is not identified to the present day, but someone that Wood may have known as a boy, a fellow a playmate or something like that. Of course, when he gets into high school, you can see that his style is much more sophisticated. He's still a very young artist and quite accomplished. I think there's no doubt when you look at these youthful pieces that you can see that he, demonstrated an ability very early in his career. Here, something that he made for a publication at Washington High School. We don't know that this was a specific person. We don't know that this is a portrait of an individual or whether he was just creating a kind of type in this image. Obviously, this figure needed to stand on one level for the entire senior class, but also there's a certain level of specificity in the facial features that makes you think that it might actually have been someone in particular. Again, still very young artist. This feels much more specific. Man of the Class from 1910, to me, this feels much more specific. It feels like it is an individual, that is somebody that he has studied. He's really worked up the composition here. He's focusing exclusively really on the head and the upper torso. This feels much more like a portrait in overall conception. And then the specific facial features. And he's really pushing himself. It's not a strict profile. It's mostly a profile, but he's got a little bit of a 3/4 view going on, because you can see just the beginning of the far brow showing up there. He knows that the face just doesn't fall off. He does have just the slightest of the 3/4 view, very, very challenging rendering to do, especially for a young artist. And it already, again, shows quite a bit of accomplishment. And this is undoubtedly a portrait. A sketch of a bearded man, a portrait of an unknown individual, but you can tell that Grant Wood is paying very, very close attention in this sketch. You can see it's on just a piece of notebook paper. It's a very small work. It's just somebody that he found particularly interesting and who might have been seated near him long enough for him to get down these particulars. And I show you an overall on the left and a detail on the right. You can see, again, this is much more of a 3/4 view. He's focusing just on the face, on this very, very expressive face. He must have found it really quite interesting, enough to devote some time and energy to realizing it. He didn't mess with the rest of the body. He really only focused on that part that was really, really important to him. And that was the head, and in particular, the face. You can see actually just with a series of lines, and mostly a series of parallel lines, that he was able to really do justice to the facial features of this older gentleman. But as a full-blown identifiable portrait, we see this early work of his brother Frank Wood as one of his earliest full-blown portraits, where we have an identified sitter. This again, his brother, Frank Wood, was slightly older than Grant Wood was. He lived in Cedar Rapids briefly with his wife, Clara Peck, who were married in 1911, but then spent most of his life and career in Waterloo, working for the Overland Company, which was related to the automobile industry. And he lived and worked there most of his life. When he was widowed, he moved out to California to be with his sister, Ann Wood Graham. But this is a very youthful work. He was born in 1886. So you can see that we're talking about a man of about 30. We have photographed from a little bit later as a slightly older man here, and you can see that Grant Wood has really nailed it. He really has picked up on a lot of the features. Obviously, in the photograph, slightly older man, the skin of the face is a little bit softer, a little bit looser, but there's still the wonderful cleft chin, the noses, the hairline's a little bit more receded in the photograph than in the drawing, but you can see the hints of it in the drawing already. And so Grant Wood has really, I think, done an excellent job at capturing this. And Grant Wood himself is still a fairly young man. He's probably 26 at this point. And so, really in full control of his artistic faculties. From a couple years later, this portrait of Marvin Cohn from 1920 actually is in the exhibition. I should differentiate which works are in the exhibition, which ones are not. That image of Frank Wood is not. The other three were. The one Frank Wood only came to my realization recently, and I was able to obtain just before this presentation, actually, a good image of it so I could include it. It is with the Waterloo Center for the Arts. But currently not on view there. This is on view, but not in the Grant Wood Revealed show. It's in the Americans in Paris show, because this dates from that summer 1920 trip that Grant Wood and his best friend Marvin Cohn took to Paris in the summer of 1920. And this is a sketch of Marvin Cohn in profile, mostly in profile. You get that very small hint of that 3/4 view there with Cohn's far brow there. This is a sketch that we know from Marvin Cohn's diary was begun on July 4th in 1920, and then continued on July 22nd. This is something that they would work on from time to time, especially when it was raining. It was a particularly rainy summer in Paris in the summer of 1920. So they would spend time drawing each other, occasionally drawing themselves. And this is something that Grant Wood worked on. He had a ready model. I mean, Marvin Cohn, they shared, accommodations in Paris in 1920. So they were there. They weren't always together. Sometimes they would go and paint separately. But in this case, when it was raining and they were both stuck inside, they were both working on things that they would have begun in the out of doors. Or start new projects. In the case of this, Grant Wood wanted to make a bas relief, a low relief bronze of Marvin Cohn. This is the drawing, and this is the bronze. And both of these are on view in our Americans in Paris exhibition right now. And so he did this drawing, and then he cast it after they returned to Cedar Rapids in September of 1920. He cast it after that point in time. So the drawing was a study, but Grant Wood was doing portraits in metal as well. And so one was a study for the other, and these are both, as I said, on view in the Americans in Paris exhibition. This work is also on view. This is a self-portrait, one of several self-portraits that we'll see together. And I thought about keeping the self-portraits separate, but I thought it was more instructive to see them in chronologically where they fell in Grant Wood's career. This is a self-portrait by Grant Wood in the summer of 1920. Again, probably something that he did when he was stuck indoors, when it was raining and too wet to go outside and work outside during that summer. A wonderful pencil sketch on brown paper of him in his bohemian best, wearing his goatee that he was to remove upon his return to Cedar Rapids, but one that he grew while he was in Paris in the summer of 1920. And this is a work that he also did on that trip. And this is a work that recently came to us, and it is also on view in the Grant Wood Revealed exhibition. And this is the first time that this work has been on view. This is a work that came to us in late 2019 from the Norris family. And this was of James Bever Norris. And the Bever family, which in Cedar Rapids we pronounce as Beaver family, and the Norris family has corrected us, it's actually Bever family, we're an important Cedar Rapids family. James Bever Norris was on the Grampian, the SS Grampian, the ship that Grant Wood and Marvin Cohn took on the way back from France. And you can see it is even inscribed on board the Grampian, September 1st, 1920. This sketch of Norris has remained in the family until it was recently donated to us. Norris went on to have a very, very important career as a baritone, and he was a singer. And although he was living in Cedar Rapids at this time, he went on to travel the country, eventually settling in California. And in a few years after this, in 1927, I found a New York Times headline that said, "New baritone heard, James Bever Norris at his best in British folk songs and ballads." So a favorable review from the New York Times by a Cedar Rapids baritone who went on to have a very, very successful career. Captured here before all of that success on a return trip from Europe. From around this same time, we also have a series of plaster plaques and bronze plaques of Charles B. Keeler. This is very similar to the size and work that Grant Wood did of Marvin Cohn. Charles B. Keeler was a Cedar Rapids artist. He was born in Cedar Rapids, got his degree first at Harvard, got his BA at Harvard in 1905, then went on to study at the Art Institute of Chicago, where he studied printmaking with Bertha Jaques, You may know Bertha Jaques. We show her work frequently. We have the largest collection of works by Bertha Jaques in the world. And she was a Cedar Rapidian, where she lived in Cedar Rapids for a brief period, I should say, before settling in Chicago and really popularized etching as a print form in the United States after seeing a wonderful display of etchings in the 1893 World's Fair. She became the person with whom you would study if you wanted to study etching. And so when Keeler was in Chicago, he studied etching with her. I should give you, here's a better view of one of the plasters. He also worked on the Cohn room chandelier that's on view in our Grant Wood Revealed exhibition with Grant Wood. Eventually, he moves to LA in the later 20s and early 30s and forges his career out there. And so we don't hear much about him in Eastern Iowa after that point in time. But it's very similar to the Marvin Cohn plaque that Grant Wood created. He created a sketch first, which we don't have, and then he would make a series of plasters, and then he would use one of those plasters to create a mold, and then from that mold, he would cast the metal plaque. And we're fortunate to have 5 versions of the plaster and the final metal plaque on view in the Grant Wood Revealed exhibition. He certainly was exploring metalwork in the 1920s. We have an entire gallery dedicated to that in Grant Wood Revealed, but he was exploring it in portraiture as well. And here, a very humorous kind of caricature self-portrait of Grant Wood done about 1925. These two were, he made a plaster mold, plaster positive, then we would create a mold from which he would cast these wonderful, very, very sort of humorous and self-effacing self-portraits of himself. And here from a couple years later, a full-fledged portrait here of Sally Staymates dating from 1927. Here, Sally Staymates is an 18-month-old. She comes from the Staymates family, another highly respected long-lived Cedar Rapids family. She's the daughter of Isabel and Herbert Staymates. And her brother, Peter Staymates, was a major print collector and donated many of his prints to the Cedar Rapids Museum of Art during his lifetime. Sally was a prominent member of Cedar Rapids community for all of her life, having passed away only in 2014. Here we see her at about 18 months old in 1927. She's seated in a child's chair, holding a wonderful block with an S on it, which is so appropriate if your name is Sally Staymates. You know, it is really kind of an attribute, a wonderful portrait of a child against a very, very sort of decorative wallpaper type background. The love of the decorative is something that you see pervasive in Grant Wood's work. Here, I love how the florals of the background pick up the tiny little florals on the collar that she's wearing. It's really an absolutely charming representation of probably a very, very animated young sitter. But I think Grant Wood has captured her very, very well. Another important Cedar Rapids family is the Turner family. And here is a portrait of John B. Turner, called John B. Turner, Pioneer. He was the father of David Turner, who was one of Grant Wood's most important patrons and really a friend of Grant Wood's. John B. Turner founded the John B. Turner and Sons Mortuary in 1888. And here you see, and this is a work commissioned by his son of his father. Here you see John B. Turner in front of a map that he loved, that he owned, and that he loved very much, the map of Lynn County. And I'll show you a little bit more of that in a second. But this is a work that he started in 1928, and then he went back in and worked on a little bit more in 1930. But in the meantime, it had been submitted to the Iowa State Fair, where it won first prize. And here is a representation or a depiction of both the painting and the map, which we own, which is not on view currently, but we own. It was gifted to us by the Turner family. Both works were. And you can see that Grant Wood has positioned John B. Turner in front of the land that he sort of lives in the space in which he lives in. You can see just to the left of his head, it's hard to make out in the slide, but you can make it out in the painting. You can see a representation of Cedar Rapids and Kingston on either side of the Cedar River. And you can also see, and I love to point this out when I talk about John B. Turner, that while Grant Wood has positioned the man in front of a map of Lynn County, Grant Wood has taken liberties with the map of Lynn County. He has removed the entire right-hand series of districts so that he could move the decorative border in so that it could be included in the portrait of John B. Turner. So if you get what I'm saying, if you look at the map of Lynn County and you look at that series of square districts along the right-hand side, Grant Wood has gotten rid of all of them and moved that decorative border of notable sites to the left so that it would be included in his painting of John B. Turner, because again, Grant Wood loved elements of the decorative. And he wanted to make sure that border was in there rather than another series of districts. But it was very, very important that John B. Turner be seen adjacent to Cedar Rapids and Kingston. So that's why, he didn't just simply move Turner over. He really needed him to be by those two cities, which is where, he was making his living, where he was, really a pioneer in the growth of the city. From the next year, when he started John B. Turner, he did this portrait of Frances Fiske Marshall. And she also comes from a prominent family here in Cedar Rapids. This is another commissioned work. Frances was born actually in Minneapolis, but her family moved to Cedar Rapids when she was still young. She graduated from Washington High School in 1913 and then went on to Coe College. She married Vern Marshall in 1919, and eventually he would go on to become the editor of the Cedar Rapids Gazette, a position that he held from 1932 until 1941. Unfortunately, Frances Fiske Marshall passes away at the age of 33. She passes away in 1928. And here's a newspaper article from that time, a scan actually of a photocopy of the article. So several generations removed of Frances, Mrs. Vern Marshall, here passing away in June of 1928. Now, Grant Wood was a family friend of the Marshalls. He would frequently have dinner with them. He knew Frances, and he was saddened by her passing. Her husband commissioned him to do a portrait of her, a posthumous portrait of her, and he used a photograph of her for that portrait. And so while we don't have that photograph, I do think it's interesting to compare the portrait that Grant Wood created with that scan of a photocopy of an article of her, and you can see that he has really, captured her very, very well. Her hairstyle, very, very fashionable for the late 20s. The shawl, while it's not the same shawl, it's very, very similar. He's really picked up on that, and it has to be very, very difficult for an artist to create a portrait, a posthumous portrait from a photograph without having the living model there. Fortunately, in this case, he knew her but hadn't probably sat there and analyzed her visually in anticipation of a portrait. And I think that he has picked up on her very well. Now, this portrait descended to her 4 daughters, and those 4 daughters are the ones who donated the portrait to the museum. For a while, they shared the portrait. They would rotate it in turn. They were all from significant, prominent families in Cedar Rapids as well. Barbara Hoffman, Patricia Sheehy, Jean Byers, and Frances Lash. And Frances Lash just passed away, the youngest, just passed away about 3 or 4 weeks ago, actually. So the last of the Marshall girls, as they were referred to in town, has passed away. But fortunately, we have this wonderful portrait of their mother here in the Cedar Rapids Museum of Art. This work, as well as the John B. Turner that I mentioned before, is also on view. This work in the Grant Wood Revealed exhibition, the John B. Turner portrait is generally on view in our regular display of Grant Wood's work. Here, a portrait of Judge Porter, which is a work that's on loan to us and is included in the Grant Wood Revealed exhibition. This is Judge Marcellus Denton Porter, who was first a judge in Anamosa, but then moved to Cedar Rapids and was a judge here in Cedar Rapids. This work, too, is a posthumous portrait. He also passed away in 1928, and his widow asked Grant Wood if she would paint a portrait, if he would paint a portrait, excuse me, of Judge Porter from a photograph. And in this case, we actually do have the photograph that Grant Wood used for that portrait. And as I said, this is not a work that we own, but a work that is on loan to us from the family. It's still actually held in the family. And then also from the same year, you get a sense that the late 20s, with Sally Staymates in 27, John B. Turner in 28, these last 3 works from 29, and now Master Gordon Fennell in 1929, was a very, very important moment for portraiture for Grant Wood. And portraiture required him to take a different approach to his artwork. Remember, he was primarily in the 1920s an American Impressionist, which is characterized by a very loose brush style. And most people, when they commission an artist to create a portrait, want the portrait to more or less look like the sitter. And frequently, Impressionism doesn't allow for that. It requires, in many ways, the artist to work in a different style if they're an Impressionist. They need to tighten up their style. They need to be less loose with their brush work. And I think we can see that in all of the portraits that we've been discussing so far. You can have elements of the painting, the costuming, the setting, or what have you, that are looser, more painterly, as we call it. But then when it comes to the face, it tends to have to really look like the sitter. And it was an important moment in time, because this is the same time, and we'll talk about this in a moment, same time he's working on the stained glass window for the Veterans Memorial Building, which also required him to think in a non-impressionistic way, to think in terms of firm outlines. Because you needed the leading to hold the color class in place. And this is the time when he also goes to Germany as a part of that commission to see the stained glass window created, that he is exposed to Northern Renaissance painting. We'll talk about that in a moment as well. All of these things combine at this very, very critical moment in the late 1920s to encourage Grant Wood to think differently about his painting style for other subject matter. And it's then at this time that we begin to see Grant Wood's depiction of the landscape change to become much firmer in his paint handling. We see that in Young Corn. We see that in overmantel decoration. We see that in numerous examples. And this ushers in what we call his mature style. Where he leaves Impressionism behind for all intents and purposes, although you'll see manifestations of it in some of his later work. and starts a new chapter, if you will, in his life. And portraits, I think, are an important part of that. Here in this portrait of Master Fennell, this is, again, a portrait of a child here about age 3. The Fennells were another major Cedar Rapids family. Unfortunately, Gordon Fennell dies early. He dies at age 28 after a 2-day illness. And this work then was gifted to us at a later date by his father, who ran the Gordon Fennell companies. And so again, really capturing this young boy with a ball. You may not be able to make it out because the background is so dark, but he's sitting on an overstuffed chair with a pillow to one side as his setting. And this work too is on view in the Grant Wood Revealed exhibition. What a breath of change this work is. Woman with Plants, which is a portrait of Grant Wood's mother, Hattie, is not set against a blank background or a map or a wall of wallpaper or an overstuffed chair. Instead, she's set against an expansive landscape of the rolling hills of Iowa. And this is a work that really is a direct result of his trip to Germany. He had been to France 3 times in the 1920s, but it was his trip to Germany in 1928 to oversee the fabrication of the stained glass window that exposed him to Northern Renaissance painting. As I said, he was already doing portraits. So his style was already beginning to change, but seeing Northern Renaissance paintings where figures are set against an open landscape with a graded sky, really was very, very impactful for him. And suddenly these sitters in these portraits have room to breathe. They have this incredibly expansive landscape as their backdrop. Here, as I said, a portrait of his mother, a photograph of his mother from slightly later. It shows that, interestingly enough, in exactly the same angle. Gives us a nice ability to compare the photograph to the portrait itself, which was created in the fall of 1929. This is a work that, again, like John B. Turner, is on view in our normal gallery presentation of Grant Wood. And you can see that here, again, he loves the elements of the decorative. While certain areas are becoming more flattened, like the apron and the arms, he still loves his rickracking, and you'll see elements of the decorative throughout his career. Here is an image of a Hans Memling, the kind of work he would have seen in Germany. He spent most of his time in Munich, but did travel a tiny bit. This is in the Louvre, so it wouldn't have been the piece that he would have seen on that trip, but it is very typical of a Memling. He specifically mentions Memling as a source. Here, a sitter set very close to the viewer's plane, with an open, expansive landscape behind these wonderful feathery trees and a graded sky. All very, very influential on Grant Wood's transition from being primarily an American Impressionist to his mature style. From the next year, from 1930, a work that is not in the exhibition, this is Arnold Comes of Age. This was done in June of 1930. This is a portrait of Arnold Pyle, who was Grant Wood's former McKinley Junior High School student and now studio assistant. Pyle recalls that he only sat for this portrait for 4 or 5 times. And from that, Grant Wood was able to create this work, which won first prize for portraiture at the Iowa State Fair in 1930, also won the sweepstakes for best painting at the fair. Arnold Pyle was an artist himself. In addition to being a studio assistant, he was an artist himself, primarily a watercolorist and primarily doing depictions of landscapes. He was an instructor at Stone City, at the Stone City Art Colony. And here I show a group of the faculty of the Stone City Art Colony. I think you can pick out which one is Arnold Pyle. If not, I'll see if you can see I'm pointing to him with my cursor here. You can see he's grown a tiny little mustache, but he has that wonderful same hairline in both compositions, and the shape of the face is identical. So this would be from just a year or two later, but from almost the same moment in time. Interestingly enough, Pyle stops painting in the late 1930s, spends his career working for Collins Radio here in town in the HR department, I believe. He didn't start painting again until the late 1960s. After a 30-plus year hiatus from painting, and at that time he was focused on abstract paintings, and had an exhibition of those abstract paintings in 1973, the year that he passed away. But the show was prior to his passing away. For 1931, another work that's not in our exhibition, but goes to this wonderful lineage of portraiture, and that's Plaid Sweater. This is a portrait of Melvin Blumberg from Clinton, Iowa. Grant Wood was commissioned to paint a portrait of the young man, but didn't want to paint a portrait of him in his Sunday best. This is Recollections from Nan Wood Graham. And he was discussing the matter with the boy's parents when the boy rushes in his football outfit, and Grant Wood said, "That's it. That's what I want to paint." And you can see why. I mean, Grant Wood's love of the decorative is totally satisfied with that sweater. And in fact, he even calls it Plaid Sweater, the composition. It's not, portrait of Melvin Blumberg. It's called Plaid Sweater because that really dominates the composition. Like Woman with Plants and Arnold Comes of Age, the subject is standing in an open landscape with a graded sky behind. This new found way of doing portraiture is something that Grant Wood is embracing. And here in 1931, a portrait of his sister, portrait of Nan Wood Graham, who was his younger sister, born in 1899, dying in 1990. And this portrait was supposedly a portrait to make up for using Nan in American Gothic and all of the the negative responses to that depiction of her. He paints her here very stylish, with her wonderful marcelled hair that you see here. But he does in a way that harkens back to early American portraiture. The oval shape, number one, is one aspect that harkens back to early American portraiture. The swagged curtain behind that's held back in place is another item that one frequently finds in early American portraiture. And then seated on this sort of older looking chair. All of these things sort of he sort of historicizes her in a way, puts her back in time, even though she's very, very fashionable with her very, very au courant blouse and her very, very current hair style. The setting is very, very historical. And it's very, very similar to what he did in Overmantel decoration, where he took the staymate's house and puts it back in time as if it were an image out of an old map or Currier and Ives pattern. This, he said, was going to be the last portrait he intended to paint. And he promised her it would be the last time that she would ever have to pose for him. I think on the latter, he was right. It was the last time, I believe, she did need to pose for him, but it was not the last portrait that he created. It may have been his intention, but reality took a hold of him, I think. And there were portraits to come. If any of you are interested, I believe this painting is currently still available. It is at Keisho Fine Arts. Last I checked, it was still available, but I haven't checked for a little while. It's a mere $15 million. And so if you have a little extra change in the bottom of the drawer, you might consider it. She is up for grabs, and it is rare that a major work by Grant Wood will come up onto the market. So if you have an extra 15 million lying about, and don't feel compelled to give it to the Cedar Rapids Museum of Art, then you could, I suppose, buy this work instead. And here we see the portrait in the house that that Grant Wood had in Iowa City. You can see it's above the fireplace there, and there's a portrait of Grant Wood, Nan Wood Graham, and the portrait of Nan. As I said, it was not the last portrait that he did. This is a study for self-portrait. This is a work that we own. It is included in the Grant Wood Revealed exhibition. And it's not a portrait that we show very often because it is a work on paper and it is more fragile by nature and more susceptible to exposure to light. We do not bring it out all of the time. So it's not something that you will see frequently. So this is a great opportunity to come on down and take a look at this work. This is a drawing that he did in 1932, and it was a study for a painting that he began in 1932, self-portrait, that is currently owned by the Fiske Art Museum. Now, this is not part of our show. It is still at the Fiske. It is on view, I believe, at the Fiske. And you can see this is a portrait that he began in 1932, but did not finish until much later, until 1941. And it is interesting to see the two side by side. And you can see the changes that he made. Certainly the landscape has changed. He's lost the suspenders from the bib overalls, which, was his style. He would wear bib overalls and a white open neck shirt. That was the style that he would wear in the early 30s. By the early 40s, he's changed that now. It's become much darker. Some scholars have suggested that he painted over the white shirt in this darker color because he was not feeling well in 1941, and that it might be an indication that he knew that his time was shorter, or that he might have been in a darker place. We have no way of knowing that. That's scholars posit all kinds of wonderful ideas for us to consider. We won't know that for sure. But it is interesting to see the ways in which things have remained the same and the things that he has changed between these two compositions. And in 1933, the year after he started his self-portrait, he did this portrait of John B. Northcott, who was from another important Cedar Rapids family. He was an important philanthropic leader as well. He died in 1933, just 2 weeks before he was to head up a campaign, a fundraising campaign for the community chest. And so he was commissioned to do this pencil and ink on paper work, which is on view in the exhibition, which was then adopted for a poster for the community chest campaign. And both the portrait and the poster are on view in the exhibition that sort of has two purposes. One was the portrait of the deceased individual, but also to fulfill his role, really, of wanting to raise funds for the community chest. And here, Return from Bohemia from 1935, another self-portrait with other people, as you can see here. This exists in two almost identical forms. One is at the Fiske Art Museum in Davenport. The other is a promised gift, as you see here, to Crystal Bridges in Bentonville, a portrait of Grant Wood. This was for a dust jacket of an uncompleted autobiography, kind of representing the artist who had traveled abroad, returning home to paint what he knows best. And it has been suggested by James Dennis that the figure standing directly behind Grant Wood is a portrait of his friend and patron, David Turner, and that the person standing behind that figure is a portrait of Ed Rowan, and that these other figures are kind of a farm family of three squeezing in from the side. I'm not sure I completely agree with that. I did a little bit of looking around for images of David Turner. I was able to find an image that accompanied his obituary, from 1954, when he's age 72. At the time of Grant Wood's return from Bohemia image, Turner would have been 53. And the man standing behind Grant Wood, in my opinion, looks much older than 53. As I myself am much older than 53. I don't believe I look like that man in that sweater coat and cap. That to me feels like a much older person. And I don't believe necessarily that the figure behind that standing figure is Ed Rowan. Here's Ed Rowan from 1934, a year before the painting. And I feel that Ed Rowan looks much older than the person who's standing behind the older gentleman. So I feel that Grant Wood has this sort of series of farm family behind him, guiding him in the creation of the works that of the subject matter that he knows best. Iowa, Eastern Iowa, its people and its places. Now, those people behind him would not be considered portraits, even if James Dennis is correct, but they would be people that Grant Wood knew that were included in other compositions. And so that got me thinking, there is a whole series of other works that Grant Wood did that I would term portrait-based non-portraits. And that's a mouthful right there. But these are works that are not portraits per se, but that we know he used real people as models. And so, for example, going back in time, we're going to do chronology again. Adoration of the Home, which is on view, not in Grant Wood Real, but in our Grant Wood, our normal Grant Wood display. Adoration of the Home is a sort of mini billboard that Grant Wood created for Henry Ely, who was creating who was building a series of homes in the then distant suburb of Kenwood, which is now part and parcel of Cedar Rapids. And this billboard briefly hung on a model home that Ely had placed in an empty lot in downtown Cedar Rapids, so that businessmen on their lunch hour could come and tour the model home and order a home for themselves in the Kenwood area. This composition kind of shows where the country meets the city. You've got the country on the left and the city on the right, which is what Kenwood was at that moment in time. Series of figures representing both the country and the city are included in the composition, and we know exactly who they are. Every single person is a person that Grant Wood knew, and he used these people as models. And these are not what I would call per se portraits of these individuals, but they are likenesses of them. It's not a full-blown portrait where you had a sitter and you just focused on that individual and their face, but he is using real life individuals that he knew. Some were relatives, some were friends, some were just simply acquaintances as models. They are clearly written down in accounts from the time. This listing comes from the both information that we've been provided, as well and is verified by information that we have found in the Cedar Rapids Gazette. Shortly after the creation of this painting, Grant Wood held a party to celebrate the creation of this work. It was quite an accomplishment, indeed, and all of the models are clearly named in the article. And what role that they served in the painting. So here, kind of again a portrait-based non-portrait, if you will. Same is true of this Cherry series. We have on view the entire Cherry series of paintings that we own. And it was the J.G. Cherry Company commissioned Grant Wood to create a series of paintings of not really of the workers, but of the machinery that they had that they could use in trade shows. In fact, the paintings did travel to trade shows and celebrated the J.G. Cherry Company. However, in truth, these paintings are both a portrait of the machinery and of the workers. And again, through the Cedar Rapids Gazette, we know who these workers were. For example, this one, the coil welder, is of Charles Sheldon, who was actually a tinsmith by trade. Here, the painter is actually Joe Horsky, who died shortly after this in 1933. The coppersmith is Louis Jondal, who retired from the Cherry Company in 1957 after 41 years working with the company. 10 tons of accuracy is actually Claire Weber, who was an employee at Cherry from 1924 to 1927, or in one account, 1937, not sure which, but then moves to California, where he works for the rest of his career. The turret lathe operator is Joe Polson or Polena. It is spelled differently in 2 different accounts in the Cedar Rapids Gazette. He retired in 1956 after 40 years with the Cherry Company. And here the shop inspector, who is Jerry Jack Nagel, who started with the firm in 1919 and was still employed as of 1960. So spent at least 41 years with the company, as you see here. And these are, as I said, both portraits of the machinery / company, as well as portraits of actual workers from the company. And you can see that he tends to be very detailed and precise in his paintings when it came to images of the machinery. It was important that since they were to be used for trade shows, that they would be accurate depictions of the machinery, and to a large extent to the faces as well as the workers. But then, given that these are in the mid-20s still, and he's still very much under the sway of American Impressionism, then you can see a looser brush handling in elements of the clothing, for example, and other features that are perhaps less important to have a very, very accurate depiction of. So you see, these are kind of hybrids. Not only are they dual portraits of man and machine, but they are also transitional pieces, if you will, between his mature style and his work in American Impressionism. And then, of course, the memorial window that we know from 1928-29. He actually received the commission in 27. His designs were accepted in January of 28. He does large, full-scale drawings of the window during the course of 28, ships them off to the Emil Fry Company in St. Louis. It's too big a job for them. They send it off to their sister company in Munich, and Grant Wood goes over to supervise the creation of the stained glass window, which, when installed, was the largest stained glass window in the United States. It was a major, major work of art. It was a major commission. It was a $9,000 commission, which was a lot of money in the late 20s. But that included all of the fabrication as well. The primary reason Grant Wood needed to go over to Germany to oversee it, not that he felt or anyone felt that the company in Germany couldn't do it, Munich couldn't do it, it's that Grant Wood knew the proper coloration of the uniforms. That was critically important. He had done a lot of research on the uniforms. Here along the bottom are 6 soldiers from the 6 wars that the United States had been involved in up to that point in time. Grant Wood had done very extensive research to make sure that the uniforms were right. And part of the rightness of that uniform would be the coloration. And the stained glass fabricators in Germany wouldn't know what the colors were supposed to be. And so Grant Wood went over to make sure on a lot of things, but in particular, that the coloration of the uniforms was going to be correct and accurate. And it's from these very, very detailed drawings. Here's an example of one of those drawings, and these are life-size drawings. And so the window was huge when it was completed. It was 24 feet high. He actually was using an old recreation room in the National Oats Building, which became Quaker Oats. And he and his studio assistant, Arnold Pyle, built a scaffold in the in this recreation room so that they could get up high and could look down on Grant Wood's drawings to make sure that he was getting the perspective right for these drawings. So here, very, very detailed. This is a pencil drawing. These drawings are the possession of the Veterans Memorial Commission. And this one of the Revolutionary War soldier, I believe, is currently on view over there. And according to accounts that I have read, Grant Wood used models, in some accounts workers, in some accounts friends, for each of the 6 soldiers depicted here in this piece. He also used Nan Wood Graham for the figure of peace or victory that you see in the center. It doesn't look a whole lot like her, but news accounts from 1928 clearly state that Nan Wood Graham served as the model for this figure. And then, of course, there's this work that everyone loves to come home to. This is American Gothic. And while this is not a portrait, it really was the house, the farmhouse in Eldon, Iowa, with the wonderful Gothic window that attracted Grant Wood first. And then he tried to picture the kind of people that he would live in that house. He uses his sister, Nan Wood Graham, and his dentist, Dr. Byron McKeeby, as models. And you can see that in many ways that they are very, very faithful representations. It's not a portrait, it's not a portrait of Nan and Dr. McKeeby. It's American Gothic. But he used real, live human beings as his model, and it becomes almost portrait-like, even though that's not the intention that Grant Wood had. Here, a picture of the models in 1942, so several years later, 12 years later, in a memorial exhibition that was held here at the Grant Wood Art Association, which became the Cedar Rapids Art Association, which became the Cedar Rapids Museum of Art, when we mounted a memorial exhibition to Grant Wood after he passed away in 1942. And by the way, American Gothic is not part of our show, by the way. Oh, that we wish that it were, but it is important in our discussion of portraiture. Victorian Survival, which is at the Dubuque Museum of Art, is another portrait-like work. It is not a portrait of X, Y, or Z. It is actually called Victorian Survival. It's really a portrait of a kind of rural spinster type who spends all of her day gossiping on the long-necked telephone, which is echoed in, of course, her own long neck. Now, this painting was based, however, on a portrait, a tintype of Matilda Peet, that was from the Grant Wood Family Archives, which is now at the Fiske Art Museum. So while it was not necessarily a person that Grant Wood knew firsthand, it is based on, or was based on, a real live human being. And then Appraisal from 31, also not in our exhibition, but you can see it at the Dubuque Museum of Art. And this is a piece where that has been suggested that the woman holding the rooster was actually a portrait of Ed Rowan, that Grant Wood had a real or perceived slight from Ed Rowan, and then pictured him as a woman in this composition. In actuality, however, we know the model for this woman. It's actually Betty Sanborn, who was an art teacher that Grant Wood knew. She was with the Cedar Rapids School District for a while, but then in the mid-30s, moved to Omaha. She had no children. All of her possessions passed to her best friend, and from her best friend to her best friend's daughter. And it was her best friend's daughter who found this photograph amongst Betty's possessions. And sent us a scan of it, and it's actually Betty Sanborn dressed up as the woman holding the rooster. And so it's wonderful to have this record of this art teacher who passed away in 1975 finally come down and reveal something about a work that Grant Wood created back in 1931. And I just want to do an aside here to remind people that the appraisal that we see today is only a fragment of the original appraisal that Grant Wood painted. I just want to remind people that Grant Wood cut off the chicken wire fence from the composition. And so now it is a much more horizontal composition as opposed to a vertical composition. But if you are so inclined, you can see at the Dubuque Museum, you can see the chicken feet. This is a fragment that actually belongs to the Cedar Rapids Museum of Art that we have on long-term loan to the Fiske, to Dubuque. And they have it, last I checked, they have it on view next to appraisal, so you can see that portion, which is no longer there. Daughters of the Revolution. Gosh, you know, I don't know any person who would admit to being the model for this composition. Grant Wood had an agenda with this composition. He wanted to portray three daughters of the American Revolution as being kind of haughty and superior and full of themselves, because it was the daughters of the American Revolution that refused to allow the Veterans Memorial Building window to be dedicated because the window had to be fabricated in Germany, and we were still sore at Germany for World War I. So, so they refused, and in fact, it wasn't dedicated until after Grant Wood's death. And so he was kind of having a comeuppance, a sort of satirical look at the daughters of the American Revolution. He very, very carefully omits the word American from this composition. And it places them in front of Emmanuel Leutz's, excuse me, portrait of Washington crossing the Delaware, which as a German American artist kind of flies in the face of these very American women. They probably don't realize that one of America's most iconic works was actually painted using the Rhine as the river and using American tourists as the figures. And so a little fun poking by Grant Wood of these, but we do believe that Grant Wood used yearbooks of DAR yearbooks to get a sense of the type of women that he wanted to portray. And so I naturally went down the rabbit hole and had to find pictures of DAR from DAR yearbooks, such as this one from Connecticut, from the turn of the century, this one from Alabama. You can see that he had an abundance of material looking at these DAR yearbooks. Here more from the time of Grant Wood, this one from Oklahoma. And so there was plenty of visual material for Grant Wood to use in kind of making this satirical look at the DAR. And just want to remind people that if you are not headed to Cincinnati to see the original, you can see a wonderful drawing for it at Coe College as part of the Coe College art collection. So be sure to check that out. Booster was a drawing that Grant Wood made for Sinclair Lewis's Main Street. This is actually a figure of a character, Honest Jim Blauser, who was a land speculator and a real estate developer. And he was actually modeled on a known individual. He was modeled on Frank Luther Mott, who was a journalism professor and dean at the University of Iowa. By this time, Grant Wood is at the University of Iowa as an instructor. And so he is encountering all kinds of other fellow faculty members. He was friends with Frank Luther Mott, and he used him. I don't have a good image of him. This is the best that I could come up with, and from several years later. I mean, Booster was made in 1936. This is a photograph of Mott in 1950, so 14 years later. And not from nearly the same angle, but he used Professor Mott as a model for the Booster. And he did some something along the same thing with this, with honorary degree. A very academic kind of subject matter. Grant Wood in front of a Gothic window, not surprisingly self-portrait, with two academics to either side. For this, he actually used two other friends of his, Norm Forster, who was a professor of literature on the right, and Carl Seashore, dean of the graduate school. I'm sorry, on the left, and Carl Seashore on the right, I misspoke, both of whom were acquaintances of Grant Wood's, and perfectly great models for him to use for the creation of this lithograph. So while not a portrait of anyone really per se, it really is an honorary degree, if you will, that is the subject matter. He uses real life human beings, exaggerates sometimes their features. I mean, Grant Wood is much more rotund, I think, here than he was in 37. But, you know, creates a composition that's not really or truly a portrait, but it's portrait-like, using real individuals as models for compositions. And so that gives you all kind of a somewhat brief overview of what an important role portraiture played in Grant Wood's career. We don't think of him as being primarily a portraitist, but when you stop and sit down and you kind of look at the full corpus of his production, and many of the works that I show you here in this screen are part of our current exhibitions. When you look at the full corpus of them, you see that it did play a fairly major role. They were frequently commissions, which was a great source of income for Grant Wood. And it was very, very important to his transition, really, from American Impressionism to his mature style. And so at this point, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen. I see that there are some comments and in the chat box, and so I'm going to look through there and answer some questions. Or if you want to ask a question, you can simply unmute. Let me see here. Let me get up here and get the chat going. So let's see here. What do we got? In the Adoration of the Home, the man on the far right seems transparent. Is that just an illusion? No, he's painted very, very thinly. And I suspect that the pigments Grant Wood used for that figure of Mercury, which represents commerce, have given up a little bit over time. I don't believe Grant Wood intended him to be transparent, but I believe that has just happened over time. But what you're seeing is absolutely correct. It does look somewhat transparent. So let's see. She's wearing a cameo. Yes, I didn't point that out, but yes, she does wear the, Hattie wears the cameo. Let's see. Someone loving the chicken feet. Can't not love the chicken feet. I mean, it's just wonderful. Just such a wonderful detail. I'm so glad it was not lost when that portion was cut off. It's so fun. So photographs were donated by Mrs. Berry. Yeah, that is the Mrs. John Berry. She's the widow of John Berry. John Berry was a photographer, a Cedar Rapids photographer, who captured a number of important photographs of Grant Wood in the late 20s and early 30s. And many of those photographs ended up here at the Cedar Rapids Museum of Art, and it captured most of our images of the Grant Wood studio when Grant Wood lived in it comes from Berry, and many of our images of the Stone City Art Colony come from John Berry. So, thank goodness he was there and took those pictures, and that those pictures have come down to us, and so I think that's the questions that I see in the chat. Does anyone have any questions that they'd like to ask? Oh, surely there are questions.
Sean, I was wondering in that last portrait of Nan, she has a tiny chicken in her hands. Do you know anything about the significance of the little chicken?
She has a chick and a plum in her hand, and it has been variously interpreted. Some, talk about it as referencing her femininity. Others have taken it to a further extreme, and I believe even Trip Evans suggests that that it speaks to Grant Wood being a homosexual.
Really?
So it's been variously interpreted by a wide range of scholars. I say that it is best an enigma. I think it's wide open for interpretation since. But there are a lot of associations with them, but I don't believe that there is a clear case. There were little chicks around, in the family. I mean, so they were around, so that it's possible it was just something that was handy, but it could have additional significance that we don't know.
All right, thank you.
Sean, this doesn't have to do with a portrait, but some of the viewers today might be interested in this, and if I can.
Hold it closer to your camera. Okay, it's picking up your background, Paul.
Yeah, I know it is.
I can see the guy, and he's standing next to.
Okay, what it is, it's George Devine, who was a major model in Spring in Town, and he visited the Sheldon Swope Art Museum in Terre Haute, Indiana, in about 1974, and had his photo taken in front of the portrait that Grant had made. And I'd be happy to copy that and send it to you so that you have a copy of that at the Cedar Rapids Museum of Art, if you'd like me to, Sean.
Yeah, please do. I've seen that image before. You may have shared it with me previously. Possibly. I don't remember, but let's make sure and get that to it. Yeah, I left off both Spring in Town and Spring in Country quite by accident because I was already super long, but yeah, he used living models for those figures as well, and so it just, even though it wasn't a portrait per se, for all intents and purposes, it feels like one. It's really about the farm in both cases, but whether it's an urban farm or rural farm, but yeah, he used live models, really throughout. Other questions? Well, I know I went super long, and I apologize for that. I don't time these things out. I just wind me up and watch me go. There is, as you can tell, an embarrassment of riches when you dig into a particular topic like portraiture and Grant Wood. The more you peel back those layers, the more that you see, and that even if it's not a traditional kind of portrait, kind of a bust-length portrait of an individual, you nonetheless see that he's using individuals throughout his entire career, and it's so very, very important to his survival as an artist and his development as an artist. So I'm thrilled that I was able to share some of that with you. Many of them, not all of them, but many of the things that I shared with you today are on view as part of this series of exhibitions that we have. And so I encourage you to come on down and see these things firsthand, because there is just an abundance of detail that you cannot see in a Zoom slideshow. So come down and check it out, because no detail is too small. For Grant Wood, there are 1,000 decisions an artist makes, even when they're doing a portrait, and are somewhat confined to the idea of having this thing look like the person that they're supposed to represent. There are 1,000 decisions that an artist makes in the process, and all of them are important to the final product. So. Thank you all for your time, and remember, this Sunday we have Paul Jewell speaking on Grant Wood's Abandoned Plans at 2 o'clock, and that is also by Zoom. So sign up on our website, followed by a week later Wanda Cohn, and a week after that by Tara Templeman. So hope to see you at one of those presentations. Thank you so much for your time.